Ours is a violent calling, but as adherents of the Promethean Creed, we believe in the circle of fire. None can come back as they once were, but in death we are returned to the ash, from whence we came, to be born anew. Our blood and bone bonded with the earth. Through fire are our remains made protein. Through the fire and the reunion of the earth do we experience rebirth. After death, after our duty is ended, we give ourselves to these elements, and in so doing, become part of them. This is the nature of the circle of fire. Primarch Vulcan. Vulcan was one of the 20 superhuman Primarchs and a perpetual created by the Emperor of mankind from altered versions of his own DNA to lead his great crusade and reunite the scattered peoples of humanity within the Imperium of man. The 18th Legion, created from Vulcan's genome and originally known as the Dragon Warriors, was renamed the Salamanders after the great fire-resistant reptiles native to his volcanic homeworld of Nocturne, in memory of the legendary contest between the Emperor and Vulcan in 832 M30 that had involved the slaying of one of those dangerous beasts. The outcome of this contest had revealed the Emperor's identity to Vulcan and restored the Primarch to the Imperium. Like his genetic father, Vulcan was a perpetual, a rare human mutant blessed with extraordinary, almost supernatural cellular regeneration that allowed him to be resurrected from death over and over, no matter how much damage his body suffered. Vulcan was able to regenerate fully from any injury, including a death that resulted in his complete molecular disintegration. This ability, unknown to him until the Horus Heresy, and his near death from an orbital atomic strike unleashed by the Iron Warriors fleet at the drop of sight massacre on Isfahan V. During the Great Crusade, Vulcan gained a reputation amongst participants for his unusual empathy for a Primarch towards average humans, as well as his extraordinary ability to craft unique and powerful items of advanced technology. Approximately 1,000 standard years after the Horus Heresy, Vulcan had 9 sacred artifacts he created around the galaxy for the Salamanders to find, intended as a test to see if they were worthy of his leadership. He then disappeared, leaving his genetic sons with the message that whenever the officer known as the Forge Father of the Salamanders had found all 9 items, Vulcan would return to lead his chapter to victory over the enemies of the Imperium. In his final days of greatest need, according to the signs first seen by the Nocturian Promethean cult book of prophecy, the Tone of Fire. When the Primarchs were first created within the gene laboratories hidden beneath the Himalayan mountains on Terra, through the machinations of the Chaos Gods, the gestation capsules of the nascent Primarchs were scattered across the galaxy. The Promethean opus, source of much of the imperial knowledge of Vulcan, tells the tale of how one of the Emperor's superhuman children ended upon the feudal world of Nocturne during one of his tumultuous period known as the Time of Trial. Among the hardy and stoic people of Nocturne, the infant Vulcan had fallen like a blazing comet and into a home of a blacksmither, a metal worker by the name of Nabel, in the city settlement of Hezoid. He had been taken as a foster child. Nabel recognized the child as one prophesied to be a savior by the teachings of the Promethean cult, and named him Vulcan. Like all the Primarchs, Vulcan grew very quickly, reaching full adulthood in a size bigger, more and more muscular than any man on Nocturne. By the age of only 3 Terran years, He was also highly intelligent, able to vastly improve the already considerable metalworking skills of the framesmiths of Nocturne. Quickly, he had risen in strength and wisdom, embracing the culture which had taken him up, working his adopted father's forge, and hunting the great salamanders and other Saharian beasts besurged by the planet's fiery temper, becoming a legendary champion in his own world's defense against far dangerous foes. Dusk Rathies, as they were known on Nocturne. In reality, these creatures were of the most degenerate and vile class of Aldari slavers, the Drukhari, nightmarish beings to whom pain and slaughter were as meat and drink, who sought to prey periodically on the hardy people of Nocturne for their own wicked sport. The Opus tells us, during Vulcan's 4th standard year, his town was attacked by these Dusk Rathies, who were on a slave-taking expedition. The people of his hometown hid, as they usually did when the decadent Xenos came raiding. But Vulcan refused to hide. Armed only with a pair of blacksmith hammers, he roused the people from hiding and drove back the assault, single-handedly slaying 100 Drukhari warriors. As word of the battles, the outcome spread. The headsmen of the 7 most important settlements on the planet came to pay homage to Vulcan, swearing to forevermore crush their foes rather than hiding from them. Against this threat, Vulcan became transformed, and his legend spread across the world. He was Fireborn, an undefeated warrior whose superhuman strength had torn the slave barges down from the sky and crushed the Xenos in droves, and whose granite-like flesh had scorned their poison blades removed, driving the dusk rafts from Nocturne. In celebration of the Primarch's victory over the Dark Eldar in what was the year 832 M30 by the Imperial calendar, a tournament of various contests involving tests of strength and craftsmanship common to the people of Nocturne was held. During the opening ceremonies, a stranger appeared. His skin was unusually pale compared to the dark, swarthy complexions of the people of Nocturne, and his clothes were very strange, made of materials unfamiliar to the pre-industrial Nocturians. The stranger asked only to be allowed to compete. The stranger claimed that he could best any man at the competitions, causing many people to laugh at the seemingly inadherent comparisons to superhuman Vulcan. Vulcan accepted the challenge, and the stranger wagered that whoever lost the competition would swear his eternal loyalty and obedience to the victor. With a smile at such enormity, Vulcan agreed to the outlandish terms. Lasting for 8 local Nocturne days, the contest concluded many tests of strengths and endurance. The people of Nocturne were treated to the spectacle of 2 godlike beings competing against one another. Utterly astonishing, the mere mortals around them with their superhuman prowess. Many of the contestants had to be called off and had to be called a draw between Vulcan and the fair stranger, for there was simply no way to determine a victor. For instance, the anvil lift, where the contestants were required to hold an anvil aloft above their heads for as long as possible, ended in a tie between the 2 superhuman competitors. Both held anvils aloft for half a day with no sign of tiring, while all the other competitors had given up after mere solar minutes. All the subscription contestants saw similar outcomes, and by the end of the local day 8, Vulcan and the stranger were tied in overall tournament. To break the tie, the elders of Nocturne decided that the winner would have to be determined by the test of salamander hunting. Both contestants were given 24 solar hours to forge a weapon before using that weapon to hunt down and slay one of Nocturne's reptilian salamanders. Assessing the task, impossible for any mere mortal, would be but a formality for both godlike contestants. The elders included the caveat that the contestant who brought back the largest salamander would be proclaimed victorious. In the end, it came down to the final trial, salamander slaying. Both men had a day and a half to forge a weapon, then go out and slay the largest salamander, a large heat-loving reptile native to Noctron, that they could find. Vulcan and the stranger worked all day at their forges, neither pausing to rest. As the local day drew to a close, they emerged. Vulcan had forged a huge warhammer, and the stranger a keen-edged sword. They both climbed to the summit mountain Deathfire, a massive volcano said to be the home of the largest fire drakes, the most fearsome species of salamander on the planet. Vulcan found his prey first, smashing his head with a single blow from his hander. As he carried the carcass back, the volcano unexpectedly erupted. Vulcan was nearly thrown off a cliff, but managed to grab onto the edge with one hand, stubbornly grasping the tail of his reptilian prize with the other. Vulcan held on for several solar hours, but his hold finally began to slip. It was at that time the stranger reappeared, carrying a salamander larger than his own. The stranger quickly threw his carcass into the lava flow, using his heat-resistant hide as a bridge to cross over and save Vulcan. Vulcan was declared the winner of the contest when they returned home, since he had a salamander hide and the stranger had lost his. But Vulcan silenced the crowd. He knelt before the stranger, stating that any man who valued life over pride was worthy of his service. At that moment, the stranger at last revealed to the Primarch his true nature as the Emperor of mankind. Vulcan would take his rightful place as the Primarch of the 18th Legion and ruler of his adopted world. Vulcan's only reservation upon departing Noctron was that he would not leave his people undefended. But in this, the Emperor countered that Vulcan's duty was not simply to be one human world, but to many. Worlds that knew the terror of the darkness and the festering alien horrors uncounted as Noctron had, and that Noctron itself, as the homeworld of a Primarch, will forever be secured as his gene son's 18th Legion, which bore his blood. Know rise, my sons, I am your father, not your king. We do not kneel in fealty. Kneeling is an act of respect. It is a tribute that must be earned, and you have earned it. Your sacrifices to save the people of Taurus division will be remembered forever. You performed what was impossible, and made the sacrifice without hesitation, knowing your task doomed you, and that it was thankless. But I give you my thanks now. The Primarch Vulcan, as he kneels to his legion in gratitude for their selfless heroism during the defense of the Taurus division in the Great Crusade. It is believed that Vulcan did not become unfulfilled with his legion for some standard years after his rediscovery, but instead stayed alongside the Emperor after his direct tutelage, during which this time he presents was kept from the wider Imperium. Although not from the other Primarchs who had been discovered to that time. During this period, Vulcan pursued with frightening speed and comprehension, learning the arts of war, history, and science, displaying a ferocious intelligence and also wisdom and compassion that were perhaps at odds with the role he had been destined to play as a general and breaker of worlds, as all Primarchs were made to be. He fought at the side of the Emperor in battle. Colossal, nameless warrior in emerald armor, skilled like a dragon in ancient Terran myth, and studied closely in the weapons forges of Mars, and with his brother Primarch Ferris Manus, whose discovery had gone before his own. When the time came, as much dictated circumstances by choice, for Vulcan to take charge of the 18th Legion. He had so well prepared for the task ahead and set about reforging them on the anvil of war. When Vulcan came to his legion, it was in the hour of their need. The 18th Legion, led by Lord Commander Cassian Vaughn, had become embroiled in the rearguard defense of a cluster colony worlds near the terrorist division against the wave of Orc Marauders. With the bulk of the Legion's Astartes, either engaged with the expedition fleets breaching space towards the eastern fringe, or committed as a reservist against the horrors of the Ranganda incursion from the halo stars of the galactic north. The 18th was the only Space Marine Legion able to respond to the crisis. Fighting against vast and overwhelming odds, the Legion's primary force, numbering some 19,000 Space Marines, had marshaled the local defenders and held out nearly a standard year, and series of running battles against with well over 1 million Orc raiders scattered across the hundreds of ramshack ships. Rock, asteroid vessels, and dozens of space hulks. The actions of the Legion had allowed the evacuations of 3 entire planetary populations to the normal safety of the Terra system, but at a terrible cost. As the conflict progressed, they suffered the grievous wounding of the commander, while the remainder of the 18th Legion became all but trapped on the dead world of Anthium, a lightning rod drawing the Orcs to them for battle. Terra's was far from the embattlement frontier of the expanding Great Crusade, and assistance from other legions would have been difficult to obtain, but regardless, such aid was not asked by the 18th, who had determined to succeed alone or die in the attempt. Knowing that by the bleeding of the Orc Marauder fleet of his strength, countless human lives would be saved, their Primarch, however, learning of their plight, refused to stand by and brought his plans to them to join them in the rapid fruition. When Vulcan arrived, he did not do so alone, for he brought with him 3,000 new initiates, the first of the Legion to be raised from Nocturne, along with a host of new warships, war machines, and arms, all fabricated to the Primarch's own exacting specifications by the Mechanium. They fell upon the Orcs Marauders like a lightning bolt, and shattered all the largest of the space hulks orbiting Anthium, Vulcan leading his warriors within, purging the vast conglomeration of wreckage and rock with the fire and planting seismic charges as its heart to destroy it. Spurred on by this unexpected aid, the rest of the 18th Legion hurled themselves in renewed fury at the Orcs besieging them, slaughtering and scattering the green-skinned Xenos before them, heedless of their depleted munitions and manpower, leaving nothing for a reserve should they fail. Caught between this hammer and anvil of savagery that overmatched their own bestial fury, the Orc horn was broken and put to flight, and the survivors were relentlessly pursued and consumed by fire. In the aftermath, the two halves of the 18th Legion met and were unhallowed upon Anathium's dead coral plains. As their saviors removed their helms, and the Terran legionaries looked upon the faces of their Nocturian brothers, and he that was their Gene Father, they could help not but know that they were one, and their Primarch had come to claim them. The survivors of the Terran 18th knelt immediately. It is said before their Primarch, but Vulcan bid them rise, saying that all his sons were equals, and he was no petty king needing shows of obedience. Instead, it was he who knelt in honor of the lives that they had saved and the price they had paid. Then, seeking out morality, wounded Lord Commissioner Cassian Vaughn, he confirmed the former transfer of the Legion's mastery by presenting the fallen warrior with the broken power claw of the Orc warlord who had struck him down to steal the pact between him and his Legion. They would fight for him, but Vulcan would fight for them in truth. After the Battle of Natium, Vulcan set about remaking and reforging his legion. Keen to keep their honor, the spirit of self-sacrifice for the Imperium and bravery he found, but also determined that it should stand together and become more disciplined in its temper and wiser in its pursuit of battle. Firstly, Vulcan was swift to gather together its desperates and deployments and unify it once again as a whole. Although he was careful to honor the past commitments it had made, such as the maintenance of a permanent garrison at Geryon Deep, who stood guard should Manticore ever return. With his forces brought together, Vulcan returned to the 18th Legion of Nocturne to where, under his auspices, a powerful stronghold equal to any legion's fortress in Imperium was behind constructed on Nocturne's moon and Prometheus to serve as its headquarters and an armory, just as Nocturne itself would now be the source of the majority of the Legion's fresh recruits. Here, the Legion was reordered and renamed, and most importantly, Vulcan set about giving it common purpose and common belief. In order to do this, he drew not only to that which he had learned at the side of the Emperor and from the Imperial war machine, but also on the culture and deeply ingrained warrior and mysterious conditions of Nocturne, in which Vulcan had been raised. In this, Vulcan was wise enough to retain and value the experience of the Terran veterans and show them respect and hold them in esteem what they had accomplished in many ways, great and small. This was given outward sign by the incorporating the 18th Legion past heraldry into that of the Reformed Legion, making their foremost warriors his pride guard. Praetorians, the elite body of chapter masters that would serve both in his honor guard and as paragons of the standards that he would let his Sea Legion. For the fallen First Legion master of the 18th, Cassian Vaughn, Vulcan fashioned him with his own hands in unique dreadnought Scorophagus, the Iron Dragon, so that Vaughn could serve as a custodian and protector of Prometheus and the future of the Legion. The remade 18th Legion would now take its name from its greatest Nocturne Sardian predators, ancient and deadly creatures whose blood was fire and whose hides were as hard as emerald steel, the Salamanders of Nocturne. In this, Vulcan's choice carried a layering meaning, to not only mirror as Nocturne salamanders monsters of savage power and a great totemic significance to the native people, but as creatures they showed unflinching loyalty to their own blood and offspring, and were never more ferocious than in the defense. It was from the bleached right skull of one such great beast, Corsair, that adorned the shoulder guard of the Primarch's power armor. The Legion now take its new emblem. When the Salamanders region re-emerged and departed Nocturne in full force some standard years later, it quickly took up a place at the forefront of the Great Crusade, smashing alien empires and bringing the lost worlds into compliance as part of the Imperium. Although it would never reach the high numbers of the legionary strength of the likes of the Dark Angels or the Iron Warriors possess, its power and battle prowess were undeniable, and its conduct in war was regarded as exemplary. It had been tempered and proven, retaining the fearless and savage spirit for which Vulcan had been renowned. But those traits were now governed and kept in check in stoicism. Lack of humble and hubris and considered surety of action, Vulcan brought to his legions focus, purpose, and wisdom. It was now said of the Salamanders that they were neither quick to anger nor prone to rush in blindly to battle as space as they had been. But once they had decided to unleash their wrath, it was unstoppable and terrifying as the volcanic fury of the dark, what they would now call home. Vulcan was able to save his genetic legacy because of them. He saw great potential. The Emperor knew Vulcan was the perfect son to temper the 18th Legion and forge it strong again. Learning discipline and patience, the Salamanders learned there is no better time to reflect than when they struck the ghosts of moment and branded them into flesh before battle. Temperance in the face of war was not only prudent, it also saved lives. During the Great Crusade, the Salamanders were attached to the 154th Expeditionary Fleet. Their forces completed by the Imperial Army regiments drawn from the planet Thera, a death world. They successfully brought hundreds of human settled worlds into the Imperial compliance. One of the few notable campaigns undertaken by the Salamanders Legion during the Great Crusade was the Imperial compliance action undertaken on the world of Caldera. Designated 154/4, known as the Ipsen by its inhabitants, the Salamanders were tasked with bringing this newly discovered world into compliance. Led by Vulcan himself, the 18th Legion was joined by the Iron Hands and the Death Guard Legions. Both led their own respective Primarchs. The world was underdeveloped and largely impossible of human life, but possessed valuable mineral deposits. However, the Imperial forces faced stiff resistance for control of the planet from the Eldar, who had placed a garrison upon Ipsen. The Eldar forces, including Silriers, Warlocks, and other combat psychers, could not have expected to defeat one legion of Astartes, let alone 3. The mystery deepened when the semi-feral primitive human tribes inhabiting the planet seemed more sympathetic to the Eldar, or at the very least not welcoming to their equally human liberators. The Salamanders and other Imperials defeated the Eldar relatively easily as expected. After the conquest, the Salamanders learned that the Eldar had been defending a network of menhirs, which served as psychic nodes and that had fed into a giant arch, where the final and most brutal confrontation between the Astartes and the Xenos had taken place. The arch itself had been located thanks to a mysterious remembrancer attached to the Salamanders with whom Vulcan had an unsettling conversation before the battle. After the slaughter ended, Vulcan saw the remembrancer loitering by the arch and then suddenly disappearing. Following him, Vulcan had his elite prior guard descended into the chambers beneath the arch through a portal at its base. There were found a crude ordering ceremony taking place, conducted by the primitive human tribal beasts, who were ready to sacrifice an ancient Dark Eldar witch. Finally, Vulcan realized the truth. The arch was in reality a webway portal, though none of the Imperials, including Vulcan, knew this at the time. Vulcan had seen a gate like this before in his Noxian youth, when Dark Eldar repeatedly utilized such portals to rapid and pillage his home planet. The Eldar had taken control of the portal by defeating their Dark Cousins, and in the process had freed the indigenous human population of Ipsen from the horrors of Dark Eldar slave raids. The Eldar had thus been seen by humans as liberators. Terrified by the defeat of their liberators at the hands of the Imperium, the natives had sought to sacrifice their Dark Eldar captive to ward off the inevitable return of her race, the mysterious Remembrancer, who was nowhere to be seen, had actually been an Emperor, an illusionary disguise, who must have had a great interest in the particulars of this mission since he had ordered so many resources to commit it to it. Vulcan ordered Ipsen and its erratically Xenos corrupted population cleansed by flame. He renamed the scored Noxian-like dead world that remained Caldera. The world was now ready to receive new human colonists and to be exhibited for the benefit of the Imperium. Not long After the successful conclusion of his campaign, Vulcan and the Salamander's Legion participated in another joint Imperial compliance action on a world known as Karatain. Designated 154/6, the Salamanders fought alongside the Primarch Conrad Cruz and his Night Lord's Legion, as well as the Mechanical Forces, the Legio Ignis Titan Legion, and the several Imperial Army regiments. During this campaign, Vulcan became infuriated with his brother Primarch and how his legion brutally conducted themselves. During notable incident, the Night Lord slaughtered the inhabitants of an entire city in order to seed fear amongst the general population. When he confronted Cruz about the legion's actions, a brief fight endured between the two demigods. After the successful conclusion of this campaign, Vulcan reported Cruz's conduct to both War Master Horus and his brother Primarch Rogul Dorn of the Imperial Fifth Legion. This incident would later sow the seeds of animosity between Vulcan and his brother Curze, causing a rift that would further widen the Great Crusade war on. The events of the Karatain would have far-reaching effects that would later play a key role in what happened to Vulcan after the tragic events of Ishtan Vive. I can scarcely imagine what inspired Horus to this madness. In truth, the very fact of it frightens me. For if even the best of us can falter, what does that mean for the rest? Lord Manus will lead us in, 7 legions against us 4. Horus will regret rebellion. Vulcan, Primarch of the Salamander's Legion. The Salamander's role during the Horus heresy is not well known to the Imperial scholars. What is for certain is that the 18th Legion, along with the Iron Hands and the Raven Guard, were part of the first wave of loyalist attackers during the drop site of Massacre of Ishtan V. After the announcement of the War Master Horus' treachery against the Emperor and the destruction of the 4 open traitor legions, the Sons of Horus, Emperor's Children, Death Guard, and the World Eaters. Remaining loyalists during the Battle of Ishtan III, the Emperor, through Rogul Dorn, ordered 7 legions of Space Marines to attack the traitor Marines, serving his beloved son and former friend. But amongst those 7 legions, 4 were already secretly traitors to the Imperium and devotes of the ruinous powers. Only solar seconds after the first loyalist drop ship pierced the cloud layer of Ishtan V, batteries of emplaced guns erupted across the earthworks dug along the Oguri Depression by the entrenched traitors. Flak fire filled the sky like upwards pouring rain, chewing through wing and fuselage, and the detonating arrow had cocoons of metal and spiraling their lethal payloads in the air. It barely dented the assault, and when the Imperial Loyalists finally made planetfall, over 40,000 legionaries tramped out of the pun scorched earth. Of their initial component, only 15 of the Salamander's gunships had been drop pods would not make the surface intact. Nigh on full legion strength would be leveled against Horus and his rebels. The Salamanders hit the Alone, the dark flank. The Raven Guard, the right, and Ferrus Manus with his elite Morlocks, dead center. Black sand created by ordnance made for uncertain footing. As the vast armies of the 3 loyal Primarchs ran, from hosts of gunships emerged through the dispelling pressure cloud of blooming drop pods. Several legionaries faltered and slipped. Sustained bolter fire met them upon planetfall, and hundreds amongst hundreds of the first landers were cut down before any kind of breach could be settled. Fire was met with fire. The drumming staccato of thousands of weapons discharged in unison, their muzzles flashing, merging into a vast and unending roar of flame. Dense spreads of missiles whined overhead, accompanying the salvo, squeaking white contrails from their rockets. Sections of earthquakes and earthworks erupted in bright explosions that threw pummels of dirt and armor and men into the air. Last bursts of it lift up the swiftly and following darkness, spreading upon the tanks and dreadnoughts that loomed behind the foremost ranks of enemy-linked defenders, only to return to the fire to spit back in reply. Flamers choked with the air, with smoke and the stink of burning flesh, as yet more historic weapons ploughed and shrieked. It was a choreography of death, but the song had barely begun in its first verse. The right flank was swollen with warriors of the 18th Legion. Salamanders teamed out their transports, quickly coming into formation and advancing with purpose. The black sand underfoot was eclipsed from sight as a green sea overwhelmed and overran it. The auxiliaries held aloft banners attempting to impose some of the order in emerging battalions. Methodical dodge, the 18th Legion found its shape and swam across the dark dunes. At the forefront of this avenging wave was Vulcan, and to his flanks the fire drakes. Lumbering from the metal spread knots of the drop pods, the Terminators amassed in two large battalions. They were dauntless, dominant, but not the most impeccable warriors of the Salamander's arsenal. Come-tempered dreadnoughts striding through the smoke laid claim to that honor. Great towering war engines, the dreadnoughts jerked with savage, recoil graviton guns and autocannons. Not stopping to see the carnage wreaked, they slowly tampered after the Russian compared the legionaries in small cohorts, attack horns blaring. The Senate Noah simulated the war cries of the deep drakes and was pumped through vox casters to voice its volume. Disorged by Thunderhawk transporters, Spartan assault tanks, Predators, Infamous, and Vindicators dissembled at a combat speed. Tracks rolling, the battle tanks rolled at the back of the line with a steep range behind them, anchoring the loyalist drop site with their armored might. 3 spearheads were given at the traitor's heart, 2 black and 1 green, all determined to bring down the Xenos fortress squatting at the summit of the Urgel Hills that overhooked the expansive. In solar seconds, and the ship thing it became a glass, vitrated by a heat of tens of thousands of weapons, and cracked underfoot. Vulcan ordered his Gene sons to take the ridge to line again the higher ground, shells perjuring off the armor. The Primarch took up the vanguard positions, whilst his chasing fire guard tried to keep peace. Behind the fire guard, the stoic advance of the Procurators struggled to keep up as they laid out sheets of burning promethium in the front and to the flanks. The Terminator armored fire drakes were also slipping back, unable to compete with the Primarch speed, and several Vulcan's officers began to see that there was a realistic danger of becoming estranged from the rest of the Legion. Adding their strength to the spearhead of the Primarch was forging the 15th Company, reconnaissance who took up fresh positions. Their charge line would take them into the Upguard Depression's heart alongside the fire guard, able to maintain pace where the bulkier fire drakes and Parcas could not. As if sensing that his legion was losing him, Vulcan slowed, but a fraction, as the fire-blackened lip of the utmost trench drew close. Hunkered within the partially sundered defenses, the legionaries of the Death Guard brought guns to near the 18th Legion. There were hardy lighters. The Salamanders had fought alongside them at Ibsen, but those days were gone, and our allies had turned into enemies. The flame storm and the ferocity of Vulcan's initial attack had scattered defenders, but they were rallying quick and counterattack from the 3 special channels. Although the tench networks was wide enough for 3 legionaries to stand abreast, the fighting was unique, thick, and fierce. Waiting before his charge, the defenders sensibly chose to hang back and harry the Primarch with a welter of bolts of fire. The defenders simply chose to hang back, and they met it head on. The Primarch struggled off the shell damage as the brass crossings broke apart against his near invulnerable Atraic armor. Across the entire Urgar Depression, hundreds upon hundreds of battles between the legionaries were fought. Some were calm and strong. Others were squads or even individuals. There was no scheme to it, just masses of warriors trying to kill one another. Most of the loyalist troops had moved on from the drop site and were engaging Horus rebels at the foot of his fortifications. But a few still occupied this beachhead. Scattered groups of traitors had spilled out as far as the drop site but were quickly destroyed by the troops holding it. These were skirmishes, and though not entirely compared to the greater battle, as the salamanders of the 15th Company pressed the attack against the retreating Death Guard forces, a dirty cloud, too thick and too low to be fog, rolled down the slopes. It spilled into the myriad trench works, funneled by the conduits of human earth. And it was fast. In solar seconds it had cleared the no man's land between the previous trench and the next blank of fortifications and was hurting at the 15th Legion Captain Nemeter and his warriors. It overtook the Death Guard first, who adjusted their power armor respirators before Masmezia hit as if they knew it was coming. It was a deadly gas attack. The Space Marine Legion's armory was vast, and not all of his weapons were as obvious as a bolter or as noble as a sword. There were those who wielded devices of much more insidious potency, the slow and agonizing ones, the weapons that forever scarred both for the bearer and the victim. They did not discriminate and made no allowance for even the strongest armor. From the vantage champion to the lowliest mortal, they were the great levelers, and their works were to be terrible to behold. More than 100 of the salamanders' reconnaissance company collapsed, choking and spitting blood. Many of the 15th Company didn't wear battle helms, preferring to be unincorporated with the stealth work as which they were expelled. These warriors had suffered the worst skin slough away by virulent acids, ravaged by pustulence and choking and vomit, eyes drowning in pus from the dirty chemical bomb. There was almost nothing left for them but half-armored carcasses. Dozens more hacked apart or shot down by resurgent Death Guard legionaries attacking in the confusion. The numerically superior Death Guard had already overrun the smaller reconnaissance company and were attempting to encircle in the rest of the salamanders. Vulcan single-handedly prevented that, hitting one overlapsing warriors and cutting him apart with his flaming sword. First, Captain Artilius Numerin, by the Fire God, joined their Primarch fractionally later and the dense, chaotic melee erupted. As the battle continued to rage all around them, the din of the melee was pierced by savage and gluteal war cries, and a ruddy smog was sweeping across the battlefield. Fashioned from blood-drenched mist and the smoke generated by thousands of fires caught in a crosswind, it slashed in the form of east and brought with it the brutal challenge of a legion that reveled in war. It was the 17th Legion, the Savage World Eaters, the 12th Legion. Ash fell from the many thousands of the free turned the sky gray. It baptized a cohort of warriors clad to various degrees in ancient gladiator trappings and wielding their ritual cadre weapons. They were the Rampagers, a deadly breed even amongst the Eaters of Worlds, a throwback to their primal Anground's youthful incarceration, as well as a slave fighter. Bellowing gluteal war cries, they charged ahead of a comfortable dreadnought to engage the salamanders. Emerald Arnold Astartes balked at what with the battle-maddened World Eaters attempted, though there was no more dirty warriors, just 3 squads. They charged over 100. Several went down sporadic bolts of fire. Some were clipped with a strange but kept on coming. Only those too injured to fight, unable to run because of missing limbs or critical wounds, were halted. Something urgent and terrible spurned on them. Even when they were warhounds, their reputations in battle, particularly close quarters, was fearsome. As the reborn world eaters under Angron, they had become something else. Rumors abounded within the ranks of the arcane devices that manipulated these legionaries' tempers. Similar curved ones on the embedded of Angron's own skull by his slaves in the courier. Now that the salamanders saw them, ignoring pain, injury, fronting with frenzy, they believed those stories to be true. As the salamanders and the world eaters fought in a bloody close quarters elsewhere in the slope, much larger flows fire drakes fought on Angron's personal guard, the Devourers, to a bloody stalemate. For once, the Lord of the Red Sentinels was close to honor guard. Angron below the challenge to his brother Primarch. Vulcan's name was heard amongst the guttural syllables of the World Eater's native tongue, anointed in blood, partially obscured by the struggling clouds of smoke and simmering heat and haze. Angron continued to bellow his challenge, and this time in High Gothic. Vulcan! His voice was like the fall of cities, rumbling and booming across vast battlefields. Angron dropped down to his brother with one of the most horsepower axes he carried. His blade was burning, roaring for blood. I name you High Redari. Farther down the slope, Vulcan gripped the half of his immense Warhammer Downbringer and went to meet his brother's challenge. But before the two Primarchs could come to blows, an arcane salvo from one of the traitor gun replacements sword-headed a muscle up in the air, and the way down it struck a part of the slope between the two Primarchs. A firestorm, a hillside. Several tones of incendiary ordnance expressed in the expansive bloom of conflagration. It swept onwards and outwards in turbulent wave, bathing the lower part of the slope in the heat and the flame. This was nothing compared to its resplendent fire. Fire drakes were embroiled in that blast, blown apart and burned to ash in the Terminator armor. Though Vulcan was wreathed in flames, he stepped down from the blaze unharmed. The renaming fire drakes gathered to him, tramping over the dead where they had to. Mauled as they had been by the world eaters, Vulcan knew that his warriors suffered, but it would not stop until they were dead by the battle was over. But it was grievously a tradition, and a traditional. And he was not ashamed to admit relief when he heard the loyalist reinforcements coming in to make planetfall behind them. Hundreds of landers of drop pods choked the already suffocating sky, and blazing with the Lombardy and the Alpha Legion, Iron Warriors, Word Barriers, and the Night Lords. The Primarch of the Salamanders merely watched impassively as the manhood shuttles and the gunship touched down, and the second wave of loyalists took up position in the edge of desperation. Angron, there was no sign. The firestorm had beaten him back. It seemed that now with the arrival of 4 more legions, the Lord of the Red Sands had already retreated. Both the Raven Guard and the Salamanders withdrew towards their drop site to give their recently arrived replacements a chance to earn glory against the traitors. Vulcan and his brother, Corvus Corax, tried to persuade their fiery-tempered brother Ferrus Manus to do the same. But the Gorgon would not be dissuaded from his task. The scent of blood was in the air, and so the Iron Hands pressed the attack against the retreating trading forces. Unknown to the Loyalists, the drop site had been fortified by the 4 secret traitor legions who had intended to form the second wave of Imperial assault on Horus's forces, while retreat of Horus's rebels raged on and disorganized. The warriors of the 18th Legion and the 21st Legions fell back in the good rear. Tanks returned to column, rumbling slowly, but steadily back down the slope. The scorched trenches erupted as legionaries filed out in vast hosts, company banners still and flying. They were battered but resolute. The dead and the injured came with them, dragged or borne aloft by their steel branders. It was a great exodus. The black and green ocean of war that was the salamanders and the Raven Guard retreating with the tide lead the fulsome of their skin enemy to it. On the northern side of the Urga Depression, a fresh sea made ready to sweep in and carry all of the mortar debris away. Across from the muster field salamanders, which was little more than a larger drop ships than the Iron Warriors, armored in steel gray, black, and yellow chivalrous, the 6th Legion looked stark and stern. They had erected a barricade, armored bastions of their own landing craft together, to bolster the northern face of the great cannons, which raised aloft behind it. Their snouts pointing into the ash, smothered sky. A line of battle tanks sat in front, bearing from the grim icon of a metal helmeted skull. And in front of that, Iron Warriors were arrayed in their comforts, thousands strong. They held their silence. And the Iron Warriors, the entire muster of the Northern Stone alone, neither spoke or moved beyond what was necessary to assemble. No one responded to the salamanders' increasingly insistent bills. Only the wind, kicking at their banners, gave any sense of an imminence of the 5th. Only when Vulcan started in the direction of his brother, Perturabo, did the Lord of the Iron return to the Lord of Drakes, glimmered gaze with one of his own. It was only at this moment that Vulcan realized that they had been betrayed. More than 10,000 guns answered. The weapons of their supposed allies turned on the salamanders with traitorous intent, crushing the loyalists of the salamanders, Raven Guard, and Iron Hands between the hammer of Horus forces and the anvil forted at this drop site. Wrath drove Vulcan up to the hillside, and at a sense of injustice, the ingumbent actions of his brother Primarchs had wounded Vulcan to the core, far deeper and deliberating than any blade. Vaunted warriors, all the fire guard could scarcely keep up. Battle companies followed in the wake of their lords. Captains warring at the attack of thousands, green armored warriors chased up the slope to kill the Gene sons of Perturabo. Withering ceasefire from both north and south forces of the Urga Depressions cut down the warriors hundreds in the first few solar seconds of deceit. The 18th Legion were shedding warriors like a snake shed scales. But still they drove on, determined to ride down back. Tenacity was the salamander's greatest virtue, their refusal to give in. Upon the plains of Isran 5 against all of those guns, this quality almost ended up the 18th Legion. Only as the majority of the salamanders crested at the edge did they first see the arc of fire. It trailed long and blazing into the darkening sky. The tongue of the flame climbed upon reaching the apex of its paradox, bent back, in and of itself into the shape of a horseshoe. Rockets screaming, it came down in the midst of the charging salamanders and broke them apart. For the Iron Warriors had unleashed a tactical nuclear missile upon their own former brethren. A savage crater was gored into the hills of the urgent depression, like the bite of some gargantuan beast resurrected from old myth, birthed in nucleus fire. It threw the warriors skywards, as if they were no more than the empty suits of armor beset bone and flesh. As a bell charged and shattered when it dropped into rocket fire from a great height, so did the legion smart apart. Tanks following after their Lord Primarch were battering, rolling across the black sand with their hulls on fire. Those vehicles in the mouth of the blast were simply ripped apart. Tracks and hatches, chunks of abused metal, torn to the exploded sharpenel. Legionaries spread the death in the initial theme of blast that eviscerated in the frag storm. Super heavies crumpling like boxers crushed by a hammer, crewmen boiled alive, Legionaries cooked down the ash in the furnace. The blast went deep, right into the blazing heart of the salamander's ranks. Only by the virtue of the fact that they were so far ahead of the prior guard spread the worse. With immense kinetic fury, the blast wave of the nuclear strike threw them apart and smothered their armory's forms in the thrust firestorm. The detonations follow, and electromagnetic pulse wipe out the Vox. A trinity stayed raining in from place in certain contact. The tactical organization became untenable. In a single devastating strike, the Lord of Iron had crippled down the 18th Legion, severed his head as sent by body conclusive spasm. Retreat was the only viable strategy remaining. Droves fell back to the throwing site, trying to climb aboard as ships that were soaring desperately into the skies to outreach the tremble storm of betrayal below. It was not a rout. Though, for any force other than the Legionaries Astartes, it would have been. Faced with such violence, many were cut down as the traitors threatened to head a war enough flack within the Armada. Despite a heroic defense, the 3 loyalist legions who took part in the battle on Ishjan 5 were pathetically destroyed. All but a handful of battle brothers fell on what fateful day, and the Primarch Ferris Manus of the Iron Hands was beheaded by his former best friend and brother Fulgrim, the Primarch of the Emperor's Children. After this sad defeat, the Salamanders, as well as the other 2 betrayed Space Marine legions, were unable to perform any further tasks the Emperor had planned for them and spent the rest of the heresy rebuilding their shattered forces, their remnants engaging in a constant guerrilla war. Both Vulcan and his brother Corvus Corax survived the ambush. On Ishjan 5, conflicting reports of the few survivors stated that Vulcan, also gravely wounded, had to be dragged away from the fight on a Thunderhawk gunship by 3 of his Primarch guards, and then managed to escape back to Nocturne. But the reality of the Salamander's Primarch's fate proved to be far more dire. Vulcan had survived the Hunukinic fire of the Iron Warrior's orbital tactical nuclear strike, where so many of his Gene sons died. Finding himself surrounded by hundreds of traitor legionaries from both the Night Lords and the Iron Warriors, Vulcan resigned himself to his fate. Fighting valiantly, the Primarch fought to the death, but was eventually overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of the enemy and was shot and stabbed and bulged into unconsciousness. The Night Hunter, now obviously insane, saw the opportunity to torment his fallen brother and took the unconscious Vulcan as his prisoner. When the Salamander's Primarch finally awoke, he found himself fettered in the massive chains that brought a gigantic Hulk-like belonging to the 8th Legion. Over the span of several solar months, the Night Hunter took sadistic pleasure in attempting to break down Vulcan's body, mind, and spirit, or kill him outright. But the task proved impossible, as every time Courage thought he had succeeded in killing his brother, Vulcan's body would miraculously regenerate to its former healthy state. Vulcan had been revealed to be perpetual, a being who was capable of continuous cellular regeneration, and therefore was effectively immortal. Much like their gene father, the Emperor of mankind, and Rage, Courage took it upon himself to kill Vulcan as many times as was necessary to permanently rid himself of his intolerable presence. The Night Hunter personally beheaded the Salamander's Primarch, ripped out his throat with a piece of cutlery, stabbed him through the chest, virtually tore him limb from limb with his own wicked claws. When these attempts failed to kill Vulcan, Courage had him eviscerated, shot at close range by hundreds of bolters, put into a penetration shaft a store shift engine, and even stripped naked and thrown out an airlock into the airless void of space. But the Night Hunter's efforts proved all for naught. Each time the Night Hunters thought he had successfully murdered his brother Primarch, Vulcan's body would continue to regenerate back to its former vigorous state, further engaging the Night Lord's master. With his unnatural abilities to regenerate revealed to him, Kurz next attempted to make Vulcan admit that he was no less a monster than himself. Vulcan was placed through unwilling trials to break his spirit, having to pull against chains to prevent his ceiling in another cell from crushing innocent occupants. Being starved at a banquet table, with mortal prisoners alongside him, watching the food decay and the prisoners wither away, being trapped in a battle plate, and being unable to control his limbs and foresee the hunt capture the soldiers and other loyalist Astartes. To further torment his brother, the Night Hunter had the Vinlake sorcerer priests use the full powers gifted to them by the Ruminous powers to ensnare Vulcan's mind and make him fight his brother Corvus Corax after a fictional rescue attempt. But even this form of sorcery failed to break the resolute Vulcan. Fed up with his insufferable prisoner and slaughtering the sorcerer priest for their failure, the Night Hunter devised a final solution to his problem of ridding himself of the Salamander's presence. Vulcan's fate would be decided in a duel to the death. He offered his brother a means of escape in achieving which what he had sought for so long, his freedom. All he had to do was navigate a labyrinth, where the center of it lay his personal Warhammer Dawnbringer. But this was no ordinary maze. At the request of the Night Hunter, the Iron Warrior's Primarch Vulcan had crafted him a singular prison, unlike any other, an imitation of his own private sanction known as the Imperium. This special prison was an elaborate labyrinth whose features, walls, and strange geographic design made it all but impossible to map and thoroughly escape. Anyone who attempted failed. The savage crater was groven into the hills of the Urgo Depression, like the bite of some garrison beast resurrected from old myth and burned within a nuclear fire. Even after trying scores of times to map the labyrinth, an individual will only manage more than a handful of turns within its twisting corridors before it all stopped making sense. In addition, Kurz repeatedly performed an ambush attacks as the Salamander's Primarch made his way through the maze. Kurz repeatedly performed ambush attacks as the Salamander Primarch made his way through the maze, wounding Vulcan without killing him. At the edge of his willpower, Vulcan had a vision of the Emperor and a vestige of remembrancer named Varys. The Emperor reminded his gene son that he would watch over all his sons when he could, and calm Vulcan's mind, instilling within him fresh resolve. Thus, Vulcan goaded Kurz, yelling out to the canvas labyrinth of how all the Primarchs pitied him, and how he was just a child raging in the dark. In response, Kurz opened up a path in the labyrinth to the center, where the Dawnbringer rested upon an energy shield. There Vulcan met the Night Hunter, and they engaged in a fierce melee combat. Though armed with a blade, Kurz gave in to Vulcan's taunts of his physical weakness and attempted to enrage Vulcan with his fist alone. Vulcan easily grabbed Kurz and, swinging him like a hammer, broke the energy shield. With his weapon now in hand, Vulcan managed to empower his Gabbler and activate the secret personal transporter built into the head of the finely wrought Warhammer. Vulcan immediately transported halfway across the galaxy and reappeared in the upper atmosphere of the Ultramarine Legion's homeworld of Macragge. As he fell from an impossible height, his body was burned to a crisp upon re-entry. But before his mind faded into blackness, Vulcan was content that he would soon find himself whole once again, and in the care of his Ultramarine cousins. His violent orbital entry crippled his mind due to the immense pain, making him mentally unstable. Later, the Night Hunter, who had become trapped in the Dark Angel's flagship following a fair boarding action during the conclusion of the Tremere Crusade, eventually made his way to the suffragate of Macragge, wanting to finish what he started and finally kill Vulcan. The ensuing battle drew both and his Primarch's brothers, Roboute Guilliman and Lionel Johnson, and a perpetual by the name of John Grammaticus. In the aftermath, the Night Hunter was defeated, but Vulcan was apparently slain by Grammaticus by the command of the mysterious Xenos organization known as Cabal. Vulcan was stabbed in the heart by Grammaticus with a piece of fulgenite, a large natural hollow glass tube formed beneath the surface of a planet during a lightning strike. The result of the Emperor unleashing his infinite psychic power against the forces of chaos a millennia ago. Vulcan's fate following the battle at that time was unknown. As Macragge became the new home of the Imperium Secundus, a second stellar empire of humanity created by the Ultramarines Primarch Roboute Guilliman, more and more survivors of the 18th Legion made their way to the Ultramarines' homeworld. Convinced of their Primarch's death during his fall from Macragge sky, the Salamanders mourned their tragic sire's loss. The Ultramarines entombed Vulcan in a heavily decorated casket of pure gold, a fitting resting place for one of the Emperor's sons, or so one would think. To the Salamanders, standing vigil over Vulcan's body, the cold Merle chamber in which now rested was a far cry from the burial rituals of Promethean cult. For all intent and purposes, the Salamanders were a broken legion. The death of their Primarch having broken their indomitable spirit. Matters, however, soon changed. The first Captain Arteus Newman was successfully saved by an Ultramarine strike force. Many were those amongst the survivors of Salamanders that hoped and hoped for the return of their first captain would give new sense and purpose to what remained of the Legion, giving them a direction once again. Yet, Numian firmly believed that his Primarch's survival, having constantly efforts the phase Vulcan Lives. This became Numerian's battle cry and cornerstone of his beliefs. Yet when Numian asked to be taken to his Primarch's grave, he found only an empty casket, Vulcan's body having mysteriously vanished from his final resting place, which planted seed of doubt amongst the Numian fellow Astartes, officers, and the other Primarchs as to Vulcan's true condition. After several citywide search actions had returned empty-handed, Numian himself found the missing Primarch's body resting in a stationary garden. None could explain how the body had been overlooked or how it had gotten there, but Roboute Guilliman soon assumed that the reason to be a malfunction of the teleportation device inside Vulcan's Warhammer, Downbringer, which the Primarch had been imbued with. For many of the Salamanders, however, this first miracle only confirmed Numian's faith and beliefs coming together. The 67 surviving Salamanders formed a new brotherhood, the Fire, and declared their intent. They will attempt to break through the ruined storm to return to Vulcan the Nocturne, either to properly laid to rest or resurrected. This was the fate they had chosen for themselves, and nothing, not even Roboute Guilliman's refusal to let them leave, would keep them from doing it. Fortunately for the Fire and 18th Legion void ship, the battle barge Cardes was docked on Port O'Hara and underlying for final repairs. With the blessings of the Primarch Sanguinius, Emperor of the short-lived Imperium Secundus, and with the tact agreement of the Lord Protector Lionel Jensen, and at last that of Roboute Guilliman, Vulcan's casket was transferred abroad to Caribdis. The Caribdis voyage of Nocturne made for a tale of epic proportions, for the alchemy it would not let the chance to retrieve the body of the Primarch go so easily. Suffice it to say that through the Salamander's heroism, obstinance, and great sacrifice did the Caribdis reach its destination. But it was not alone. Both the Death Guard and the World Eaters had followed the valiant battle barge's horse, intent in claiming Primarch's body and the mighty weapon still lodged in his chest. In a last desperate gamble, the Krabbe sacrificed itself on the guns of its enemies to allow the 20 survivors of Prior, amongst them Artilius Numeran, to covertly evacuate Vulcan's casket in a Thunderhawk gunship towards Noxian's surface. This ruse de guerre was, however, only short-lived, and the Thunderhawk was soon severely damaged, causing it to crash along the Assyrian plain. Fortunately for Numen and his fellow survivors, Noxian was not entirely defenseless, as Lord Chaplain Numen's Fire soon rushed in with a small party's crash site, retrieving the Primarch's body just in time to reach the Legion's new bastions, the Draconis Gate. The Salamanders defended their home world against the invading Death Guard forces and utterly annihilated them. With the enemy defeated and Noxian safe, the proper ceremony was conducted to remember Vulcan's passing. The Primarch, still wearing his Articulus armor and clenching the hammer Dawnbringer in his hands, was carried into the fiery heart of Noxian's sacred mountain, Mount Deathfire. The Fulgurite spear was still just jutting down from his chest, as no one was able to remove it. In the presence of the remaining more than 700 honor guard, all that remained of the Salamander's legions, as far as any of the Salamanders knew, Vulcan was lowered into the burning caldera of the volcano. No further miracle manifested itself. Vulcan had been given over to the earth and consumed in the flame, and had not risen again. To those that had witnessed the miracles around, Artilius Numeran had shattered the flagships of the cursed voyage. Deception came hardest, but even they recognized after a few solar days that the final ceremony to honor Vulcan had given them closure. From the ashes of defeat, the 18th Legion would rise again, as it had done before. With another amongst them to lead the Legion, only one man did not believe so, Artilius Numeran, first captain of the Legion. The former commander of the Fire Guard would not see his faith go unrewarded. Numeran was racked by grief, yet his heart fell alight with faith. The first captain resolved to be the one last sacrifice, to trade his life in exchange for that of his Primarchs. Covertly escaping the bastion of the Dracon's great Numeran, stripped of armor, weapons, and rank, used the dawning of Noxian's time of trials to mask his escape and stall any form of pursuit before he could reach Mount Deathfire. There he immolted himself in one of the mountain's fiery crevices, unable to see his Primarch again to know if his sacrifice had been successful, an act of pure faith. When Numeran's Estral companions could finally, though without endangering their companions, due to the volcanic and geological instability of the time of trials, only 3 of them went to search for him: Sergeant Beric Zetos, blacksmither Egan Gargle, and legendary Abimelin mounting jet bikes. The swiftest way to travel to the most ash plains of Noxian, the trio encountered a solitary figure kneeling in the desert, obviously weak and disoriented, rejoicing at having found a comrade and friend. The astonished of the right of the Salamanders fell to their knees in suspicion when they saw the figure turn around and rise unsteadily to his feet, a hand clutching an all too familiar spear, top still embedded in his chest. It was their Primarch Vulcan lived. The events immediately following the end of the Great Galactic Civil War are even more obscure in current Imperial records, and perhaps known to the Tantan masters of the Salamanders Lepracraculus as what is clear, however, is that when the Ultramarines Primarch Robert Gilliman authored the Codex Astartes during the time of rebirth at the end of the Horace, and that prepared the plan to safeguard the Imperium from another civil war by breaking down Space Marine legions into a single chapter comprised of only 1,000 Space Marines. Vulcan stood alongside Leman Russ of the Space Wolves and Rogor Dorm of the Imperial Fist. In opposition to the plan, However, like the others, Vulcan eventually capitulated rather than put the unity of the Imperium at risk once more. The 18th Legion appears to have signed no immediate successors, and it is likely that their numbers were so depleted by the events of the Istran 5 Dropside Massacre that it was not possible to divide it into separate chapters. Several chapters were created much later in subsequent findings, which might share the genetic inheritance of the salamanders, but no evidence exists of the second founding. Successive chapters having been sired, the extent to which the dictates the Codex Astartes were adhered from the map of the breakup of the legions varied greatly, and the salamanders appear to have obeyed it in some respects, while ignoring it in others. The fielding of only 7 overstrength companies is one example of this, though in other respects of the present-day Salamander chapter is largely compliant with the dictates of the Gilliman's throne. The ultimate fate of the Salamander's Primarch is a matter of much conjecture, for he disappeared many standard years after the Horus Heresy. Some sources state that Vulcan led his chapter for 3 entire millennia before he departed on some mission he never declared the Imperium at large. Though scant evidence of this in the deeds throughout that age remain. The tale is all made the more mysterious by the fact that Vulcan appears to have left behind him a text called the Tome of Fire, within which is locked the nature and the location of 9 artifacts the Primarch wielded to his chapter. It is said that over 1,000 standard years after the events of the Horus Heresy, Vulcan hid these 9 artifacts around the galaxy for his chapter to find, as a test to see if they are worthy of his leadership. Of these 9 artifacts, 5 have been recovered, 3 of which, the Spear of Vulcan, Cassia's Mantle, and the Gauntlet of Forge, were wielded by the chapter's current Forge Father, Vulcan Histan. 2 of the Chalice of Fire and the Eye of Vulcan remained on the Nocturian moon of Prometheus in the chapters of the Father's Monastery, while the last 4 of their artifacts, the Engine of Woes, the Obsidian Chariot, the Unbound Flame, and the Song of Empathy, have yet to be discovered. The Tome of Fire claims that only when all of the artifacts are recovered that by the Force Father Salamanders, as 5 now have been, will Vulcan judge the Salamanders sufficiently tempered to have passed down the ultimate contest. Then, so the legend states, he shall return to lead the Salamanders in the final war against the enemy of humanity in accordance with the prophecies written within the chapter's most sacred tome.